Hey, everybody. It's 2 p.m., April 2nd, 2015. Unless you're listening to this as a recording later on, then it's probably not April 2nd, 2015. Hope that you're having a great day. We certainly are, and we're excited to have you here. We're talking about advocacy today. You can see it on the screen, making the case why advocacy by nonprofits is so important. As I said a few seconds ago, Abby Levine for Alliance for Justice is here to present with us today in partnership, obviously, with BoardSource and part of the Stand for Your Mission campaign, and she'll talk a little bit more about that as we get started. But first, before we do, I just want to tell you a little bit about our platform. If you've been with us before, you know how this works, but if you don't, just take a couple of seconds. If you have questions, and we certainly hope that you do, please use that Q&A or chat box on your right-hand side of the screen. It doesn't really matter which one because I'll be checking both of those throughout our presentation today. So if you have a question or a comment, just enter it in there into the chat or the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't see anybody else typing in, that's fine. It's set up that way. We can see everything that's typed up, and I will respond to you. If for some reason we don't get to your question right after you've answered it, don't worry. We will save a couple of minutes at the end to get to questions, but we'll try to get to those as needed throughout our event today. If for some reason you have technical difficulties, if your sound drops out or anything like that, shouldn't be a problem, but on the rare case that that does happen, wait about 45 seconds to maybe 1 minute, and it probably will come back. 95% of the time it does. If it does not, use that event info tab in the top left-hand corner. You'll see it there, and that'll have a telephone number that you can call in to listen over your telephone. Your telephone is always your best way to listen. You'll have less drops, less pops, that sort of thing, than you would normally sometimes get over a broadband connection. I think I've told you a little bit about somebody has already told us that they found the chat box. That's awesome, Linda. Good job. It's right there. The Q&A box as well is right there. So we'd love to hear any questions or concerns that you might have. I told you a little bit about Abby, but I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about herself. Like I said, any questions or comments, just go ahead and feed them to us. We love hearing what your questions are, and that's why we're here to help your organization and improve your sector and your community. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Abby from Alliance for Justice. Hey, Abby.
Hello. Thanks, Andy. I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon and partnering with BoardSource and the Stand for Your Mission campaign to be presenting this webinar. In fact, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars that we will be doing this month to promote the importance of nonprofit advocacy. Today, as Andy has just mentioned, we're going to be talking about making the case, why advocacy by nonprofits is so important, and talking about, first of all, what advocacy is, and then why it's really an important role and strategy and technique for nonprofits to engage in. Next week at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, we will talk about the legal rules regarding advocacy. There is a lot of question, a lot of confusion, a lot of myths and misunderstanding and bad information in the nonprofit sector about what nonprofits are legally allowed to do. And too often nonprofits think, well, we're not allowed to talk to legislators. We shouldn't be trying to get people to register to vote. We shouldn't be involved in policy and advocacy. We shouldn't even mention the word lobbying. And most of that is not correct information. And so next week we will go through how much as organizations we can do. So again, today we'll be talking about why it's so important, but rest assured what I'm going to be talking about you can do, and next week we'll get into the details about how you can do it. And then finally, in 3 weeks, we will be talking about how to put all of these pieces together. And essentially, knowing why advocacy is so important for your organization, knowing what's legal, we'll then get into some of the basics of how to create a game plan. What are some of the key advocacy capacities that you need to be an effective advocate? What are some of the key strategic questions you should be asking, you should be thinking about? And finally, what are some ways to evaluate advocacy? So again, I know some of you are just joining us for today's webinar. Some of you may be joining for all 3 or coming in and out, but just wanted to let you know what is ahead for the next few weeks. At Alliance for Justice, we are a nonprofit. ourselves that have been working for many, many years to empower organizations to be bold, strong, effective advocates. And through our Bolder Advocacy initiative, we work with hundreds, if not thousands, of nonprofits and foundations every year to make the case for advocacy and to really go through the legal nuts and bolts about how different types of organizations can get involved. Today we are going to be, and over the next 3 weeks, going to be providing an overview, in some way sort of a sneak peek at many of the resources that we have and much of what you need to know to be an effective nonprofit advocate. But we could spend hours, and frankly, we could spend days going through all of the details and all of the rules and all of the best cases and talking about all of this. While we will not be doing that on these webinars, since I know you do not want to sit at your computer for days on end listening to me, we do have lots of information on our website, which is bolderadvocacy.org. And on the screen in front of you is a snapshot of one of our pages where you can see the different resources that we have. And we have lots of information that you can access from the navigation bar at the top. And the contact information for our office. One of the great services that we provide, in addition to doing webinars like this in partnership with other organizations, or sometimes trainings for the staff or board of a particular organization, and having all of the written information on our website, we also have a free technical assistance hotline that is supported through many of our generous funders and foundation partners. And you can see right under the Contact Us button, or the Contact Us title, that our toll-free phone number. And you can call us, and it is staffed by either me or one of my colleagues, and my colleague Isaiah Castilla, whose smiling face is in front of you right now, are available every day to answer questions, whether it's questions thinking through, should we get involved in advocacy? What does that mean for our organization? Or, okay, what's the difference between advocacy and lobbying? Or we're going to lobby, how do we track it? What do we need to report? Can we talk about a candidate? Can we talk to a foundation about advocacy? Feel free to call or email us with questions. The one caveat with that is that while we are lawyers, we are not your lawyer, and we can't provide legal advice, but we can walk through the questions. We can sort of talk through some of the factors that are involved, and if we think you should talk to a lawyer, we'll let you know. But again, feel free to call or email us. It's no cost to you, and we're happy to talk through the issues that affect your organization in as much detail as we can. So for the last year or so, Alliance for Justice has been partnering with BoardSource and the Campion Foundation and the Forum of Regional Association of Grant Makers and the nonprofit Council of Nonprofit Associations on the Stand for Your Mission campaign, which is an effort to encourage board members to take an active role in advocacy and to really become advocates for the organization. And I'll talk more about the campaign at the end of the webinar, but it's something that if you're thinking about for your organization, and particularly how do we talk to our boards about this, what are some of the questions we should be asking, I encourage you to go to the Stand for Your Mission website, which is standforyourmission.org. We're very clever with our naming. Or to find it from the BoardSource website. But again, it's part of this effort, recognizing that for many organizations, whether we work specifically with the nonprofit state associations or the Regional Association of Grant Makers or boards, of how important advocacy is, and trying to find some better ways to have united language, common messaging, to be able to sort of bring home the point about that advocacy is an appropriate, that advocacy is a normal activity for nonprofit organizations, just as any other type of board governance or mission-related work. So as we start thinking about today's webinar, and really looking at making the case for why advocacy is so important, particularly by nonprofit organizations. Before we get into that, and before I really get into the why, I want to talk about the what. we often hear the term advocacy, and if we were all in a room together, I would start off by asking, how do you define advocacy? What does advocacy mean to you? And I'll get a lot of different answers to that question. One way and you can think about it if you want to take a second and jot down for yourself how you define advocacy right now. I'll give you 15 seconds to do that.
It's an interesting question, and it's something that, we hear the word all the time. We think we know what it means, but I'm interested in hearing the expert.
Well, one thing is, and to be clear, that there is no actual precise definition of advocacy. The dictionary, Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, defines advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal, or the act or process of advocating something. At Alliance for Justice, we often talk about it as any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, supports or defends, or pleads on behalf of others. Another group that I was looking at defines it as public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. One thing that comes across in all of those definitions is speaking out on behalf or supporting a cause. And when we're talking about advocacy, we're really thinking about speaking out on behalf of an issue or a cause, or in many ways, I'm thinking about public policy advocacy. I mean, frankly, we're all, and again, I could ask you whether thinking about, do you consider yourself an advocate? And hopefully you all do. We advocate every day for ourselves, or hopefully we advocate every day for ourselves, whether we're trying to get a seat on the bus, whether deciding what we want for lunch, whether whether you're negotiating with a child about allowance or a friend about what movie you're going to see. You're speaking out for what you want. And that's what advocacy is. In terms of the nonprofit sector, we really think about it in terms of speaking out for what is important for our organization, or hopefully speaking out for the mission of our organization and for the people, the communities, the issues that we work on. And so and I'm talking about in terms of systemic advocacy, where we're trying to change policy. Advocacy could also be filing a lawsuit on behalf of one person to get remedy for one particular wrong, or it could be, again, trying to get benefits or get somebody rehired after a wrongful fire. But we're really looking at how do we change the system that works in favor of the cause, the issue, the community that we care about. Again, as I was looking at and how a lot of different organizations define advocacy, another good definition, and as I was looking at a brochure that a family foundation, the Toe Foundation in Connecticut that supports a lot of juvenile justice work, put out this great piece looking at the power of advocacy and talking about why their foundation decided to support advocacy. And looking at advocacy as that advocacy is when individuals and groups of people who may be gathering in networks or coalitions develop an opinion about a social issue, work to find evidence to support their stance on that issue, and share this evidence with those who are in positions to make changes to the policies that affect that issue. And in that's really what we're talking about, identifying a problem, trying to figure out what's wrong or what's not working or what do we want, finding research or making the case for how we get there, and then figuring out who we need to influence, who can bring that change to us. And we'll talk about how that can be done in lots of different ways for lots of different reasons, but that's really at the heart of what we're talking about in terms of advocacy. Now, getting to the point that Andy raised a minute ago in terms of, sort of what's the distinction or what is the legal definition, or maybe this is actually a comment that somebody typed in about, how laws or policies can affect our success for communities. When we think about advocacy, there are a lot of different types of advocacy. There are a lot of different ways we can support a cause. there are a lot of different ways we can develop an opinion, that we can try to influence an opinion or try to make change to policies. Lobbying is one type of advocacy, and next week we'll get into much more detail about the definition of lobbying and how we distinguish lobbying from advocacy. And frankly, next week we can get into why it's important to distinguish lobbying from advocacy. But essentially, lobbying is trying to influence legislation, trying to influence city council or Congress or our state legislature, trying to stop a bad bill, trying to get a good bill passed, trying to support ballot measures. That's a type of advocacy, but it's only one type of advocacy. And frankly, it's probably the type of advocacy that's used least often. Public education, talking about the issues that you work on, is a type of advocacy. Educating legislators about the work that you do, about the needs in your community, about the people that you serve, is a type of advocacy. And I'll go through examples and how organizations use all of these to further their missions. Doing polling to find out what people in your community actually want or what they think solutions should be. As we talk about what advocacy is and why it's important, what I hope is becoming clear that yes, a part of advocacy is going to government and saying, you know, with our hands out saying we want something, we need you to do something for us, or sometimes we demand change or we demand something. But most of the time, it's us going to government saying, we're experts on an issue. We're experts on our community. Let us share that information with you. Let us tell you what we've been hearing. Or alternatively, translating information that government or decisions that government has made and helping people be aware of how they can take advantage of that or what those rules are. And so again, we'll go through examples of that, but it's important to recognize that advocacy is really this broad array of different types of activities, different types of strategies, in many ways different types of tactics. Now, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, is advocacy and community organizing the same thing? And I used to think it is, and I used to think that community organizing is a type of advocacy. And in fact, on the screen a minute ago, when I said, what is advocacy, one of those boxes was community organizing. And for some organizations, for some movements, some networks, think of community organizing is a way to gather people in a community to push for change on a particular issue or to identify a particular issue that they'll work on. And for some organizations, advocacy and community organizing are sort of synonymous. Other organizations, on the other hand, as we've talked to a lot of organizations around the country, sort of really see them as two different goals. And that advocacy has the goal of changing public policy, changing what government does, pushing for a particular issue, pushing for a particular solution. Where community organizing, on the other hand, its goal is not the policy change itself, but is really about building power in communities and building leadership. Policy is often a means to the ends of building power, that it gives people something to gather around, it gives people something to work towards. But for some organizations, they really see the advocacy and community organizing as two ends of a spectrum. A lot of organizations, on the other hand, as we have community organizing in blue, advocacy in red, a lot of organizations sort of come to bring them together into some avenue, some shade of purple, where again, using people in the community to advocate for issues, using people in the community to figure out what the issues are, what the tactics should be, and recognizing that we're not trying to build power just to build power, we're doing it so we can make change. But I did want to highlight that that there are different organizations use these terms differently. And just as with advocacy, when you can be talking to people, and whether it's talking to your funders, talking to your board, talking to your neighbors, and using the term advocacy, they might think, or they may assume, that you're talking about lobbying, or you're talking about marching in the street, or you may be thinking about doing public education polling. On the same end, you may be thinking about advocacy, and somebody else may think of community organizing, or vice versa. So in many cases, when you're talking about this kind of work, it's really important to move beyond labels, to move beyond just talking about advocacy, just talking about organizing, and assuming that everybody knows what you mean by that, but really getting into, we are going to get involved in advocacy by doing X, Y, and Z, or we're going to advocate because we think we need to change this rule or this policy. And again, next week when we get into the distinction between advocacy and lobbying, and I should say the distinction applies under federal tax law, which I know is just so exciting to probably all of you on this call. You know, I'm sure that's what gets you out of bed in the morning, is just being like, can I focus on federal tax law today? But as nonprofit organizations, primarily 501c3 organizations, or charitable, religious, educational organizations, being classified as a 501c3 tax-exempt organization means that we can receive tax-deductible contributions, which for most of our organizations is essential to keep us functioning. It also means that in many cases we're the recipients, or the preferred recipients, of private foundation grants. So maintaining that 501c3 status is really important. And it's the tax code, within the definition and within the rules for 501c3 organizations, that distinguish between advocacy in general and lobbying. And so next week, we'll really get into those nuances and talk about what the distinction is and why that distinction matters and when it matters. But in terms of thinking about what you want to do and thinking about how you should incorporate advocacy into your organization, today when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about all types of advocacy, and including the different ways in which, and the different ways we can the different avenues of change we can use to try to influence public policy. We can work through the executive branch, and again, whether that's with federal agencies here in Washington, D.C., or with your local housing authority. Whether you want to go to the legislative branch and work with your city council or with the U.S. Senate. Again, a form of advocacy may be litigation, filing a class action suit, or challenging the constitutionality of a law. Litigation, working through the judicial branch, is a type of advocacy. Nonpartisan electoral work, and frankly all electoral work, is a type of advocacy. Are you trying to ensure that people have the right to vote? Are you trying to get people out to the polls? And the types of work and the types of electoral work that organizations can do, again, comes down to tax law and comes down to the rules that govern us as 501c3 organizations, and I can touch on that a little bit more next week. Sometimes we often think of advocacy, most of the time when we think of advocacy, we're trying to influence government. We're trying to shape government policies through the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, or at the ballot box. Sometimes, however, advocacy might even include trying to influence corporations, and we might be trying to shape to change the way different types of corporations behave, and we'll go through some examples of that. As you think about advocacy, it's important to recognize that as you think about advocacy and think about why it might be important to your organization, I'm not prescribing any one of these avenues of change. There's no one that's right for every organization. There's no one avenue that's right for every issue. It's important to recognize that these avenues are tools in your toolbox, and all of the different types of advocacy that we'll talk about are strategies and techniques and tactics that are in your toolbox. And it's important for you to be aware of those, of what's in your toolbox so you can use the right tool at the right time. So again, I want to be clear that it's not saying that you need to use all of these or that anyone is right at any particular time. But as we think about what advocacy is, it's just important to remember that I'm talking about it in its broadest form. So now that we've gone through some definition of what advocacy is and really thinking about it in a really broad sense, now I want to get into sort of the heart of the matter in terms of what is advocacy, or in terms of why is advocacy important for organizations. And in all cases, it really goes back to what is the mission of your organization. As much as I'm an advocate for advocacy, and as much as I go around and encourage people to get involved in advocacy and to understand the legal rules of how they can do advocacy, what's really important is that advocacy is a tool, a technique, a strategy to accomplish your organization's mission, to fulfill the goals that you've already set for your organization. It's not to do something just to do something. Advocacy should not be this separate set of activities that's separate from the core work of your organization. Advocacy is a way to further your mission of your organization. And that's why, in some way, it's a little bit hard to have this conversation without a discussion, sort of doing it one-sided or hopefully two-sided with you asking questions, making comments, but without being in the same room, being able to talk more freely. It's also important to recognize that the reason for an organization to get involved in advocacy will differ for every organization. And I'm going to go through a number of examples and hopefully reasons, and hopefully some of those will resonate with you. But it's important to recognize that every organization's mission is different. Every organization is serving a different purpose. Every organization has different reasons for being in existence, obviously. And so it's important for you to think about how does advocacy fit within your organization and what makes sense for you. And again, and I'll keep coming back to remind you, it's also important to remember that you don't have to do it all. And just because one organization, and maybe an organization that's in your community, an organization that you're partnering with, an organization that wants to partner with you, just because they're doing all sorts of activities doesn't mean you need to do it. It doesn't mean you need to jump in with 2 feet or 4 feet or, turn your whole focus right now to this. It's important to figure out what makes sense for you and how to use advocacy as a strategy to accomplish your organization's mission. And arguably, every organization, regardless of your mission, has some way that advocacy plays into it. Again, we are all organizations. As organizations, we are all bound by tax law, if nothing else. But as you think about why your organization was set up, and so let's say you're an organization that's in existence to get people to stop smoking, and you have a goal, part of your mission is to have the U.S. be smoke-free by 2020, or any time period you want, but your goal is to try to get people to stop smoking. Well, how do you go about doing that? You could share personal stories. You can do research about why smoking is bad and why secondhand smoke is bad and show lots of pictures of what it does to your lungs, and you can do research that talks about that. You can have lots of forums and school presentations talking about the dangers of smoking and secondhand smoke. You can do surveys of the public to find out where they stand on smoking and what their views are. You can share what other communities are doing and how they've gone smoke-free, and you can do all that, and you need to do all that. But will that be enough to get a community to go smoke-free? Maybe. And all of that, I would say, is a type of advocacy. But maybe you need to go beyond that and to think about, maybe we can try to get businesses to voluntarily go smoke-free. There was a big campaign a few years ago from the American Lung Association, many others, to petition Major League Baseball teams to prohibit smoking in their stadiums. It wasn't something that there was no law that was going to be passed, but it was urging baseball teams to be good role models and to model behavior for people in the community. That's a type of advocacy. But it may be saying, well, you know what, we can do that and we can go door to door to every business and we can talk to people about why it's bad, but maybe at some point we're going to be limited. Maybe we need to try to force people to do something. Maybe we're going to need to have a municipal resolution prohibiting smoking in our community. Maybe we want to try to do it statewide. Do we want to do it in the entire city, in all public places? Do we want to do it in all restaurants, in bars? Do we want to do it in parks? There's no right way to answer these questions, and all of these questions are strategic, and again, on April 16th, we'll get into some of the strategic questions. But it's important to recognize that as you think about what are the different ways to accomplish your goals, advocacy often fits into that, in terms of finding out what people want, sharing information, sharing what's worked in other communities. When other communities have raised the amount of the cigarette tax, has that reduced smoking? If they raise it by 5 cents, does that work versus raising it by $3? Have there been efforts to prohibit sales of candy-flavored tobacco or trying to prohibit it on school grounds? You know, again, all of these are types of advocacy. I'm not going to tell you which one makes the most sense or which is the right approach, because there is no one right approach. But again, it's recognizing that if your goal is to have a smoke-free community, it may take all of these approaches, or it may take some of these approaches. But chances are you're not going to be able to accomplish this goal merely by going door to door and saying, I hope you stop smoking. And I don't mean to make light of that. You know, another effort, if your organization's goal is to try to get paid sick days, how do you do that? Again, you can try to get private companies to provide paid sick days to their employees. You can do research looking at how having paid sick days is beneficial for the bottom line of businesses. You can do public education campaigns. You can have ballot measures trying to force communities to do it. You might want to support candidates, and again, it depends on the type of organization, and I'll just say 501c3 organizations can't support or oppose candidates. But that is a strategy that unions or social welfare organizations can use. That it often takes, when we're thinking about advocacy, in order to accomplish our goals, it usually requires some form and usually a combination of different advocacy strategies. But again, I encourage you to think about, for your organization, is there a way you can accomplish your mission without some form of talking to government, sharing information with government, communicating with the public? And again, we'll come back to more reasons. But before I go on into sort of more reasons and sort of talking about different reasons that it may resonate with your organization, I want to just address the elephant in the room, or the elephant that may be sort of in your minds, or you might be thinking about going, well, advocacy, oh my gosh, this is scary. People tell us to not focus on this. People say it's, you know, it'll push people away from our organization. And so again, you know, and if we were all in the same room, or, sort of ask, what scares you about advocacy? And I think it's important to think about that, and not to, because often, again, it's important to address those concerns so we can move past them. And reasons that people often talk about with advocacy of what scares them is that it's the unknown. So much of it is out of our control. It might be on controversial issues. It's complex. There are legal rules. It takes a while. And yes, all of those things may be true, but some of those we can deal with. In fact, when we talk about advocacy, most of the time, most organizations, when they get involved in advocacy, are not taking up hot-button issues like abortion or even immigration control or fracking. Most organizations, when they get involved in advocacy, are talking about, are we going to have more funds for our after-school programs for the year? Are we going to be able to provide to enable kids to have access to playgrounds? Are we going to have a stoplight at the dangerous intersection in our community? When we think about advocacy, in many cases, when we sort of move away from the sort of hot-button issues that often are sort of the issues that often get on the front page of the paper, most of the time, and when you look at the local section of your paper, where there are often organizations talking about trying to change, changing zoning laws, or trying to change the hours of schools or the speed limit on a road, are issues that, yes, people will have views on both sides, but are usually not those most hot-button issues. And for most organizations, the position that you take come naturally. If you're an organization working with people in a community that are hard of hearing, it's going to be probably natural to you that you're going to work to make sure that people, when they are in court or in the hospital or trying to deal with city government, have access to interpreters, or and so again, many of the issues that you work on and the positions that you take will come naturally. Yes, advocacy often takes a while, and as we'll talk about on April 16th, there are ways that you can plan for that and that you can, talk to your funders, talk to your board about that. And so again, a lot of these issues, it's important to have the conversations about it, and it's important to make sure people are all on the same page, and that your board knows what you're doing, that sometimes your funders know what you're doing, and to know what's legal. And all of those issues are things that, again, you can think about. But in many cases, the question should not be, should we think about advocacy? And again, advocacy in that really broad sense, but what happens if we don't? Again, thinking about the mission of your organization. What if you're not at the table when decisions are being made about funding? What's going to happen to the people that you serve or the work that you do? And again, when we think about this, it's really important to recognize that there's no right way to do it. And when we think about it, and I want to start, and one of the goals of this webinar series is to really help you understand what's possible, what your organization can do. What you should do is a separate issue. That's a strategic decision between the staff, between the board, with your funders about what makes sense for your organization. And again, we're not here to tell you what you should do. We're really here to talk about what you can do so you can be strategic, you can be thoughtful. As you're making those decisions, you can use all the tools in your toolbox that you have. And again, just to be clear, there is no one-size-fits-all with this. Just like, one pair of pants doesn't fit us all, there's no right way to do this. And every organization's advocacy will look different, and that's okay. You don't have to emulate any other organization's way in which they do it. But it's important to figure out what makes sense for your organization. So I now want to go through a number of examples to try to help walk through how advocacy may be important or may resonate with your organization. Again, most of us are not dealing with those really hot-button issues that, the talking heads on TV, focus on all the time. So if you're at the YMCA and you work with kids and your, goal is for, you focus on youth development, healthy living, social responsibility. Trying to get kids fit or to prevent kids from being obese, trying to help deal with the obesity crisis in our country is a very fitting activity for the YMCA to do. Now, for people who work with kids, people who have kids, people who work in the health field may know that there is this epidemic in our country and may recognize what that epidemic leads to, and that it increases costs on our healthcare system, it increases absenteeism in schools, and when kids stay home from school, guess what? Their parents who work have to stay home from school, and that has whole trickle effects on the economy and on our society. You may know that, and all your friends may know that, but does everybody in your community know that? Possibly not. As organizations, we often assume that the issues that are so obvious to us and that we know that, that we care about, we think that everybody else knows about these issues. I was actually talking to an organization a few months ago in Maine that called, and they were dealing with an issue in a particular community to deal with kids who are facing conditions from lead paint. And I was like, lead paint is still an issue? Like, we're still dealing with that? And it was like, yeah, we are. And it's, in my world, it's not something that I think about. And so making sure that people, and particularly policymakers, who often live in a very insular world and talk to people they want to talk to, and often only listen to people or ask people's advice of people that they want to hear from, that they may not have any idea of those issues. And part of our job as organizations is to provide information about that. So again, you might not even think having Childhood Obesity Awareness Month, putting out information about statistics, you may not even think that is advocacy. You may not even think that even if you do that report, sending it to the legislators and the policymakers in your community is advocacy, but it is. So again, it may not even be anything new. It's just a different way of thinking about what you're doing. Whether you're the YMCA, whether you're a theater group, whether you're the ballet, whether you're a church, what type of work that runs programs, a food bank, you may rely on government funding for various programs. And for a lot of nonprofit organizations, have very close partnerships with government to provide services and rely on government funding. How are those decisions made? In the budget. What is the budget? That is a piece of legislation. The budget, how funding decisions are made, is a type of advocacy, and being involved in those decisions is a type of advocacy and is something that is really important for organizations. And this, in many ways, is one of the reasons that often organizations get involved in advocacy, because their funding is being cut, and that's one reason to get involved, and it's something that organizations may want to pay attention to. And again, it's not saying that your organization needs to become the expert in the state budget. There are organizations that do that. There are great organizations that do that in every state. Some of advocacy is connecting with other organizations, sharing information, figuring out how you can connect to existing organizations. It's not saying that every organization should become an expert on the budget, but thinking about what it means for your organization, what do you need to know, how can you contribute? It's also really important for organizations to get to know policymakers. And again, not just getting to know policymakers when you want something, when you want your funding restored, when you want an ordinance passed. It's important for policymakers to understand the work that you do. It is astounding how few policymakers understand the work of the nonprofit sector. And the National Council of Nonprofits and all of the state associations do an amazing job of doing reports and economic studies looking at the contribution of nonprofits and showing how big of a percentage in the workforce and how much revenue is generated in the state through the nonprofit sector. And again, and that's really important, and it's really important for policymakers to know that. I was once talking to an organization who was talking to a policymaker, to a legislator, and was talking about, and I don't even remember what the particular issue was, and they were like, well, there are no nonprofits in my district. And that's astounding. Every congressional district, every city council district, every single district, however you slice or dice those lines and how you define a district, has nonprofit organizations, whether it's a church, whether it's a Little League, whether it's a school, whether it's the YMCA, whether it's a Jewish Community Center, whether it's Board Source. You know, there is a nonprofit organization all over. And it's important to make that connection for policymakers. And again, they might think, well, what does that have to do with me? And this is a great example of, sorry, I was sort of stuck on North Carolina here with my examples, but of the Arts or Arts North Carolina having an advocacy day, of going to the Capitol to talk about what the arts and the role it plays in North Carolina, and talking about how many people it brings into the community. And, you know, Asheville, for instance, known for its, you know, artsy community. Well, that's really important, but the policymakers make those connections, not necessarily. And it's also really important to build those relationships, again, before you need something. You know, let them know what you're doing. Let them know about how you serve people in the community, and invite them to events, invite them to tour your site, so they have a sense, so they know who you are, so your name is familiar to them, and it's something that they like and trust and respect, is really important. And again, when we talk about getting to know policymakers, it's not just during elections, it's not just during the heart of the legislative season. In some way, that's the hardest time to do it. This should be an all year round activity. Sometimes it's, again, building rapport, making introductions so they know who you are, so they know that you exist. Sometimes it's to educate them. Again, I'm sort of stuck here on North Carolina, but it's sort of, you know, this was a report looking at what happens if the state eliminated taxes on capital gains, how it would make the tax system unfair and increase the state's revenue challenge. You might think, well, shouldn't legislators know that, or shouldn't policymakers know that? Don't they have people who could do that research? Not necessarily. They often rely on advocates to provide that information. And rest assured, somebody else, and it may be whoever is in favor of eliminating the taxes on capital gains, those wealthy people who pay capital gains, that they're advocating. They're telling policymakers why it's really important to eliminate capital gains. If we are not providing the other perspective, if we're not saying, well, yes, we understand why some people may want to eliminate them, but this is the impact if we do, they're not going to hear that story. They're not necessarily have the time or the inclination to go out and fact-check information that someone else has provided them. And so it's really important for us to recognize, even saying, well, we may not have as much money, we may not have as much time as, you know, big business or well-funded industries, but we have expertise. We have credibility in our communities. And if we're not educating the policymakers on the issues, giving them the facts that we want them to know, no one else will. And we have to remember that in many cases, we're the experts. And we often, as nonprofits, tend to be modest and tend to sort of underplay our role and underplay our expertise. We are the experts. You are the experts in your community. And if you're not sharing that information, no one else will. And so we really have to provide that information. It's also important to think about, as organizations, that advocacy provides a way to have discussion in our communities. And sometimes as an organization, you may know what the answer is, and you may say, we need immigration reform, and we want immigration reform that does X, Y, and Z, and you may have it all planned out. Sometimes you may not. You may say that we know there's a problem in our community. We know there's a lot of hostility, and there's a lot of tension, and it's not good. And as organizations, as nonprofits, you often have the credibility, have the trust of people in the community that can bring people around the table to have a conversation. And again, it may not be that you have an intended goal, but to have those conversations, to think about what's working. And again, too often in our society, based on our soundbite media or our sort of gotcha news where it's all about talking at each other. And as organizations, as nonprofits, we often can bring people together to talk to each other and to figure out where we have more in common than we have in opposition, and to think about how we can go forward to make progress. On the other hand, sometimes it may be, we may want to foster, you can see my bad hand-eye coordination going on.
Needed here.
Clearly I spend too much time at my desk and need to play more video games or something. But sometimes we do know what we want, and we want to demand change. And we'll say, we know there is a problem with gun violence in our community. We need something to happen. Now, by demanding change, it may be that we want a law passed. It may be that we want agencies to change various rules. It may be that we want stores and private companies to change what their selling practices. Again, even if we say we want something to happen, we need to reduce gun violence. Again, that's not saying what the advocacy strategy should be or even how we go about doing that. But again, thinking about advocacy, that sometimes it is providing that expertise and sometimes it is having an opinion of demanding change. And again, just as in the beginning, talking about the importance of community organizing, sometimes, again, it's important to build people up in communities, and advocacy often provides a way to empower your constituents, to provide a role for people in your community, to take ownership of something, to take leadership, to recognize that they have a voice. And while nonprofits are often the voice for people and for underserved people in particular, which is really important, we also can help people realize that they have a voice. And you don't need a special degree to talk to a legislator. You don't need any special qualifications. You don't need a job where that's your job title. Anyone can do it. And as organizations, we can empower people to recognize that they can go in and talk to their policymakers. And so recognizing that empowering role that we play is really important. Again, sharing our expertise, and apparently I thought this was so important that I put it in here twice. But as organizations, again, we often are doing research on issues. We know what's working. We have ideas of what we recommend, and often we talk to each other about those, and that's important, but the more we can share that, and whether it's tweeting it out, whether it's writing op-eds, whether it's having discussions, whether it's, again, talking to policymakers about it, it's really important to share that expertise. You are the experts, and so much of what policy is and so much of what advocacy is doing that. It's also important to recognize that for many of us and for many of you and your organizations, I'm sure you're tired of doing the same thing day in and day out and sort of feeling like, how do we get off the treadmill of, keeping people behind bars, or having people who need to rely on a food bank, or people who need to rely on a shelter for housing? How do we change the system? How do we make it possible for people to break out of that cycle of dependency or need so they can be more self-sufficient? I think for every nonprofit, that's our goal, that in many cases we want to put ourselves out of business. There's only so much money that we have, and even if we put every foundation in the world and all of their assets together, that's still a drop in the bucket to how much government spends and how government's priorities are. And so in many cases, to try to change the system, to try to stop from, emergency, foster care, or locking people up, or, putting small children who've, in juvenile detention, to having homes to where we can rehabilitate people, or getting people out of, off of a line in a food bank to being able to buy their own food. We often want systemic change, and very often that can only happen by changing the systems, by often tapping into government funding to get money to be able to change that system. As there's some organizations that think of ourselves as advocacy organizations, where we sort of look out and go out for issues of how we want to make change. For some organizations, again, you may not think of yourself as an advocate, but again, policy happens to us all, whether it's the budget and changes to the funding, whether it's policy changes that may affect your ability to receive tax-deductible contributions. Many states have tried to take away the property tax exemptions for nonprofits. That's key. And again, there's some organizations like a symphony or a theater may say, well, what does advocacy have to do with us? Well, if your organization suddenly had to pay property taxes on your theater, that could put you out of business or make you double your fees. That could have a big impact. You might be a clinic that provides medical treatment in a low-income area. If there were a bill that would criminalize anyone who provides services to anybody who's not documented, that could completely change how you go about your work. And so again, it's important to recognize that while some organizations may go out and try to proactively make change, it's important for all of us to recognize that policy affects us all. And as the National Council of Nonprofits so aptly puts it, advocacy matters, and nonprofit advocacy matters in terms of, again, whether we're reacting to what's going on or we're being more proactive. And then finally, maybe.
Yeah, when it turns blue.
Oh, okay. It's also thinking about advocacy as you're thinking about your recruitment, as you're thinking about your board recruitment. Who else do you want to join? What capacities are you missing? And this might be a good way to find some new board members. It also again, thinking about in terms of the mission of your organization, Friends of the Earth is trying to protect the environment. Well, we're trying to convince EPA to ban bee-killing pesticides may be important. So again, regardless of what your mission is, there is a way that advocacy plays into it. And I encourage you, if you can't think of a way, call me, and I will spend time brainstorming with you. Finally, in the last minute or so, again, I want to just point out that through the Stand for Your Mission campaign, where you can find more information at standforyourmission.org, we've created a tool, a guide that's meant for discussions among board members about advocacy. And I encourage you to download the guide and to think about this with your board. But even if you're a staff member, even if you're a volunteer with an organization, I encourage you to download the guide, and particularly looking at some of the questions about discussions to have, thinking about ways to think about advocacy, sort of some of the steps of looking at the shared vision for your organization, thinking about how to develop a deeper understanding of your work. and then identifying opportunities and threats provide some really good questions for you to think about in terms of how does advocacy fit in with your organization. So I've talked a lot longer than I thought I would, but I really encourage you all to, spend a minute now or after you get off the webinar of answering this question. How will advocacy help your organization fulfill its mission?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Abby. Obviously, there was a lot of content today, and we hope that you got a lot out of it. There are a couple of questions, and I promised you that we would answer those questions, and I know that it's coming up on 3 o'clock. If you have to log off, don't worry. I've recorded this webinar, and if you shoot me an email at andy.davis@boardsource.org, I will email you a link to this recording. But before we go, I do want to ask these questions. Our organization has been moving over the past couple of years from an anti-hunger organization to an anti-poverty one. We are planning to launch a single staff-led advocacy campaign, and one concern is needing needing to go beyond the safe advocacy. For example, everyone to go beyond everyone deserves food to more controversial earned income tax credits. Prison reform, school reform, et cetera, ones that may move the needle a bit more on poverty beyond food. Are there any recommendations for us going down this new path?
It's interesting because I think what is considered to be safe, again, is all in the eyes of the beholder. And I think it's really important to have the conversation starting with the board of the organization about if we've decided to go, to become an anti-poverty one, there are policy, or there are value judgments, and there are, value decisions that are made that are inherent in that. And I think it's important to recognize that advocacy is not neutral, but your organization is also not neutral. We all make value judgments in who we are as organizations and who we serve and what our priorities are. And by focusing on and making the decision to focus on anti-poverty, and I commend you for doing that, it's important to recognize that some people may not agree with everything that you do, but they're probably not going to agree with what you do no matter what. And if you really want to move the needle on these issues, it's important to stay true to what you want to do. But I think it is important to have those conversations with the board, and maybe to do it gradually, and sometimes you'll be surprised that some organizations, when they take positions that seem a little bit more bold, it actually creates more support for the organization, that there's actually people in the community, and no pun intended, but sort of hungry for that and are looking for someone to step up. And so, it's important to know your community, it's important to know your board, it's important to know your funders, and to sort of do some prep work for that. But I think in terms of accomplishing the work of our organizations, there's risk in everything that we do. And frankly, there's risk to the people you're trying to serve if you don't move to outside of sometimes some of those safe areas.
Yeah. By the way, somebody had asked, and I'll repeat it again, Andy, A-N-D-Y.Davis, D-A-V-I-S, @boardsource.org. Email me, and I'll send you a copy of, or a link to a recording of this email. Okay, last question. In terms of researching issues, it seems essential to find research that is as unbiased as possible. How can an organization ensure that the groups behind the research are not pushing their own agenda and leaving out research that does not support their viewpoint? What makes solid research on policy issues?
That's a fabulous question. That would probably make a really good webinar talking about that. There are probably whole academic courses on that. And in some way, it's in, it's in the eye of the beholder. And, I think lots of organizations put out research, and do it in lots of different ways. What's so important in the advocacy world is to be credible. And just like in so many things, it can take a long time to build a reputation, and you can demolish it, very quickly. And so you want to be credible in the research that you put out. Now, different organizations, and you may do the research through a particular lens. Your research may have a particular focus, and that's okay, and you can be upfront about that. You can look at, and talk about who funded your research or who did the research. But again, recognizing that but you want to be clear about what your methodology is and whether it's, academically proven research, is it, a survey monkey research, per survey. Again, it's really talking about your methodology and being upfront about where the information comes from.
Okay, that is our last question. Thank you all for sticking with us. We hope that you learned as much as I did anyway. Tons of information today, and there's going to be more information next Thursday afternoon, April 9th, the day after my birthday, in case any of you cared. Webinar, You Can Advocate, the overview of the legal rules. So we'll dive more into that kind of subcategory under advocacy and nonprofits. My email, andy.davis@boardsource.org. If you want a copy of this email, or if you have a question for BoardSource, if you have a question for Abby. Also, Abby's email was on the slides that we sent earlier, so either one of us can help you answer your advocacy questions, and we'd be happy to do so. So I'm going to let, I'm going to let Abby get to her last slide here that's got some contact information in it. Don't forget, you do have these slides. They should be in your email. If you don't see them, check your spam folder. If you still don't have them, andy.davis@boardsource.org, I'll send you another copy. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. We'll see you next Thursday. Talk to you soon, everybody. Bye-bye. Oh, if you're still on with us, take the survey that's about to pop up on your screen. We'd love to see your thoughts of this webinar. Take care.